So tonight we are going to continue with the Maimonides with Rambam. If anyone is new, I'm going to interchange the term Rambam for Maimonides between his Hebrew and his English titles. And we are up to part 1, chapter 2. So I'm going to post a link right now to the area in Sepharia. Give me 1 second here. Where we're up to, so you can look inside if you'd like to. I'm going to post it in the chat. Where are we chat? Here we are. If you click that link, then you will land at the Friedlander translation. And for those, there are some new people here, so for those that haven't done this before, when you follow in the Friedlander translation in English, on the page that I just put up there, you can scroll past the Hebrew part, and then there's English, and it won't sound the same as what I read because I'm reading from the Pines translation, but you could still follow along the basics. I'm not a big fan of the English translation the Friedlander one that's online. I'm a bigger fan of the Pines one, but you should still be able to follow the ideas. So that being said, let's start with a couple things I wanted to tell you all. If you remember, and remember at all times, please feel free to speak up if you want to say something or ask something or etc. But if you remember, I had mentioned many times the fact that even though Rambam says often about how he's writing for the intelligent people, not for the general masses, he constantly contradicts himself and throws in ideas that are clearly meant to teach the general public. And I wanted to point you to an article that I just, I subscribe to various lists. I don't even know how I found them that send me the latest. And because I always read the articles that are related to Maimonides, especially the guide to Perplexed, which we're reading, I just got sent from some random one of these lists, an article by a professor in Tel Aviv University named Sarah Klein-Braslavi, who I mentioned her name to my father, who right away said, "Oh, I got her 2 books. She has these 2 big books on Maimonides, but they're in Hebrew," and he started telling me about them. But sure enough, she had written an article in which she discusses what's some new English words that non-intellectuals like myself learned. The term exoteric with an X, E-X-O-T-E-R-I-C, versus esoteric with an S, E-S-O-T-R. And exoteric means knowledge that's expounded to teach the general public, and esoteric is knowledge that's expounded to teach a select few. And she, with a lot of highfalutin intellectual language, says the same point that I came up with in the Rambam. And if anyone wants a copy of that article, just text me offline and I'd be happy to send you a copy. But it was very nice of me to see that. It felt really nice. I'm self-educated in this book. I've read it numerous times, and I've read and I keep on reading, but I never had a formal PhD in Maimonides theology or anything. So it was really nice to see a real scholar say the same point and point out that despite the fact that Maimonides keeps on claiming that this book is esoteric, in actuality, it's meant to be exoteric. It's meant to be for everyone. So it was very gratifying to see that. Another thing I wanted to mention, as we learn through this section of Rambam, where it's couched as if it's a description of words. It's really, it sounds grammatical. He's describing different words and what they mean. And in the previous lectures, I tried to drive home the point, and I'm going to continue to drive home the point, that this examination of words, it's not dry grammar, but Rambam is really trying to explain to us that if we try to understand words, what they really actually mean, then we can have a much better understanding of what the Torah is trying to tell us, is trying to teach us. And Rambam gave some incredible examples that we've studied, and today is going to be a spectacular example of how the simple translation of a word that Rambam teaches us means something else that we thought it might have meant, gives us a totally new window into the meaning of the text, which also brings to another point I want to make before we do chapter 2, and that is the I think I might do this. I'm not making this promise, but I might do this on a weekly basis, and that is I want to drive home how important Maimonides himself has been to the development of world religion, period. Certainly Judaism, but world religion, period. Now, this part of Maimonides, where he examines these words, is one of the most, probably the single most influential part of Maimonides, possibly of all of his writings. Well, how could I say that? Well, I'll tell you how I say that. One of the most important disciples of Maimonides, he wasn't a personal disciple, because he didn't actually sit by Maimonides' feet and study, was the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, who was born not long after Maimonides passed away, and he was born, I think, in the town of Narbonne. I think it's in southern France, northern Spain. I might be wrong, and lived until the early 1200s. And he was famous for writing commentaries on Tanakh, on all of the Bible, and he focuses. He's very much Maimonidean in this specific sense, clearly, where he analyzes the meanings of the words. He does a grammatical analysis of what the words mean and uses that to explain the meaning of the verses in the text of the Torah and the words of the prophets and so on. The Radak has become the standard of all of the Mefarshim, of all of the commentaries on Tanakh. Radak has become the standard. Now, one of the things Radak was famous for was defending Maimonides against the attacks from the more traditionalists that didn't like him. The Radak spent a large part of his life writing letters and standing up to defend Maimonides against the many attacks from many quarters. And the Radak, interestingly, also spent a significant amount of his time debating Christian scholars in open debates and in writings and so on, back and forth regarding the meaning of the text. It just so happens that the Radak became so popular among Christians that when the King James Bible was written, which has become probably the most iconic of all of the early translations, the writers of the King James Bible, when they analyzed and translated the Old Testament, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, used Radak as the basis for their translations of the entire, what they call the Old Testament, or what we call the Torah. Now, so it became the foundation of the English Bible, which anyone that reads the Bible in English today is reading Radak. So Maimonides' understanding and way of interpreting the Torah through these verses has become the standard of everyone pretty much across the world that reads Bible today, regardless of whether they know even a word of Hebrew. Now,
I'm sorry. Can I just ask, how do we know that they relied on the Radak? Did they say so?
You can look it up. You can see the scholars. Everyone agrees with me. I'm not making this up. That their favorite when they came to Hebrew phrases that they didn't know how to use, the Radak was the standard, with the exception of those verses which they deliberately wanted to interpret in a way that supports Christian ideas and Christian theology. There they rejected Radak's interpretations, and in fact went back to the original Radak manuscript and censored it. So the Radak that we have today in most of our most Jewish publications is the censored version. Although it is available, you can buy the original Radak, in which his translations, which conflicted with Christian interpretations, were put back in. So there's various. If you get a Makros Gedolos Tanakh, you have to make sure you get the one that has the uncensored version of Radak in it, and not the censored version. But with those exceptions, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, to answer Dan's question, we have around a dozen books in the yeshiva. Ben Mintz is a whole bookshelf on the first row, which is all about the making of the King James volume of the Bible. So Beautiful. We have like a dozen books on it, and you could borrow one, Dan.
Yeah, you can see that, and you'll know that you'll see what I'm telling you is an accepted fact. So just think about the immense amount of influence Rambam and his method had. But now let's go and see what the translation of one word can do to the meaning of one of the most iconic chapters in the entire Torah. And that is, we're going to start chapter 2 of part 1 of the Guide of the Perplexed. And I'm going to jump back and forth. I'm going to read from the Pines. I might jump to Kapach's Hebrew a little bit here and there. For those that don't know Hebrew, I promise to translate everything. Try to follow along if you only have the Friedlander. And I might at some points say what he's going to say and then read it. At some points I might read it and then say what he said. With, of course, at various times going off on whatever tangent might be important. So years ago, this is chapter 2. Many years ago, a learned man propounded as a challenge to me a curious objection. So this elderly, scholarly man came to me and asked me a question that was really bothering him. And I'm going to answer this question, Maimonides says. Now, before I read this question, I'm going to read you again a story that we're all familiar with to some extent, and that is Genesis chapter 3, the famous story of eating of the Eitz Hadat, of the tree of knowledge. And in chapter 3, it starts off the Nachash, the snake, or the serpent, however you want to translate, Haya Arum, he was the smartest or shrewdest or sneakiest of all the animals in the kingdom that God had made, of all the animals of the field. And the snake came to the woman, came to Eve, Chava, and said, Af ki amar lehem, is it not true that God said, did he really say that you shouldn't eat from all the trees in the garden? The woman says to the snake, no, we're allowed to eat from all the trees. Well, there's only one of the trees, right? Only the tree in the middle of the garden is the one that we said we can't eat, otherwise we will die. So the snake tells her, no, you won't die. And then what does the snake say in verse 5? Because God knows, ki yodea Elohim, because God knows, ki v'yom acholchem imenu, on the day you eat from this tree, v'nifkechu einechem, your eyes will be opened, v'hiyitzem ke'Elohim, and you will be like God, yodei tov v'ra, those that know the difference between good and evil. Vatar ha'isha ki tova eitz l'ma'achol, and the woman saw that this tree was good to eat, and this is important, and that it was desirous to the eyes, and it looked beloved, it looked delicious to gain wisdom, to gain knowledge. And she took from the fruit and ate it. She gave it to her husband with her, and he ate. And both of their eyes were opened, and immediately they knew that they were naked. And then they took fig leaves, they made belts to cover their genitals, to cover their private parts. So clearly they immediately saw their sexual organs and saw that there was, they saw something raw, they saw something bad, and they covered it. And then you can continue the story and so on, but I wanted to read that point. Now, what exactly happened here? I'm not going to answer that question because the Rambam is about to answer that question. What was it that happened when they ate the Eitz Hadat, and what's going on? So this person, this learned man, he thought that what had happened was that the knowledge of good and bad, that knowledge that we in the last chapter spoke about the difference between humans and animals, that the great thing that people have is this wisdom, is this knowledge, is this intellect. And that this intellect is what defines the difference between humans and animals. And this intellect is what we then gained when we were when we ate from the Eitz Hadat. So he's there, but so before, however, Rambam continues, before mentioning his question and its invalidation, before I tell you what he asked me and what I tell you what was wrong with what he asked me, let me tell you some other fact that you need to know. And that is the meaning of a word. I shall make the following statement, Rambam says. Every Hebrew, every person that knows Hebrew knows that the term Elohim, which we translated as God, right? And I deliberately used the hey, Elohim, as God, because it doesn't mean God here, like Rambam's about to say, is equivocal. It's one of those terms which can mean several things. Designating the deity, it could refer to God, but in some contexts, the angels, it could refer to angels. And in some contexts, it could refer to the rulers governing the cities. It could refer to judges. In the Hebrew, in Kapach, he doesn't translate rulers governing the cities. He translates it as judges that have to judge. Onkelos, the proselyte, the famous Onkelos, Targum Onkelos, has made it clear And I believe Rambam says that his clarification is correct, that in the dictum of scripture, that the proper way to read this word, and he shall be as Elohim, that if you eat this, you will be as Elohim, does not mean you shall be like a God, but rather knowing good and evil. Rather, the last sense is intended. For he had translated V'itsem ki Rav Revin in Aramaic. Rav Revin means like the leaders. It doesn't mean you're going to be like God. And now what does this mean? We're going to get to it in a second. So the Rambam is saying that term is mistranslated, and that mistranslation in terms leads one to ask the question that this learned man asked, and it leads one to completely misunderstand the point of the story. Okay? Now remember, this is in the context where Rambam just told us in the last chapter that the thing which makes human beings somewhat like God, in other words, to some extent, is that we have this ability, we have this intellect, we have an understanding, right, that animals do not have, that, and no other creature on earth has. That's why God said, let's make human beings like us, because similar to us in the sense that we have that intellectual capacity. However, the Rambam says that's not what it's talking about here. Here it's talking about something else. By eating this, we somehow become like judges. Now, what does that mean, we become like judges? Now the Rambam is going to go back to what was the question? What is this learned man's question? And it's interesting to note, Rambam did not call him an ignoramus. And as we all know who've been studying together, when Rambam didn't like what someone says or thought he was foolish, he very quickly called him an ignoramus. But he didn't, he said, no, he was a learned man who's just mistaken. After thus having set forth the equivocality of the term, now that I explained to you that the term Elohim does not necessarily mean God, but it can mean something else. And anyone that reads Torah knows that what Rambam just said is absolutely true, like he told us. We shall begin to expound the objection. Now let me tell you what his question was. This is what the objector said. This is what the guy's question was. It is manifest from the clear sense of the biblical text. When one reads the Bible, it seems clear that the primary purpose with regard to man was that he should be, as the other animals are, devoid of intellect. He should be someone that has no knowledge of Tov Bara, no knowledge of what the difference is between what's good and what's bad, right? That was the point. That's what it seems like it says, right? So of thought, no knowledge of thought and of the capacity to distinguish between good and evil. However, when he disobeyed, he didn't listen to God. His disobedience procured him as its necessary consequence the great perfection peculiar to man, namely his being endowed with the capacity that exists in us to make this distinction. Because he disobeyed, he all of a sudden now has the ability to discern between good and bad, which makes him unique, which makes him special, which is the great thing that makes human beings human. Now, this capacity is the noblest of the characteristics existing in us. This is what Rambam just told us last week is what makes human beings special, right? This is the greatest of characters that we have. Now, it is a thing to be wondered at, that man's punishment for his disobedience should consist in his being granted a perfection that he did not possess before, namely the intellect. As a punishment for being bad, he got rewarded with the greatest thing that human beings have ever had, the thing that makes us special, the thing that makes us unique. This is like the story be told by somebody that a certain man from among the people disobeyed and committed great crimes. And in consequence, he was made to undergo a metamorphosis, becoming a star in heaven. Like, what's that? What kind of punishment is that? He's referencing various Greek myths of someone who was bad, a murderer, and all of a sudden he becomes a star, a constellation, right? This was the intent and meaning of the objection, though it was not textually as we have put it. In other words, I didn't quote him exactly as he asked me the question, but this was the basic question that this man had. Now think for a minute how, before we read Rambam's answer, I want to put it out there for a second and see if anyone could think where Rambam's going to go with this answer. I'll give it maybe one or two choices if anyone wants to say what they think. And if anyone wants to try, just go ahead and unmute yourself. If I have no takers,
I'm sorry. What's the question that you're
question is,
asking?
how do you think you would answer this question, this learned man's question?
The learned man's question being, what did this mean?
Yeah, and how could it be that as a consequence, as a punishment for being bad and disobeying God, he basically gets, instead of punished, he gets rewarded with the greatest things that human beings have?
Well, I might answer it in two ways. One, which is the greatest thing that humans have is the ability to make distinctions, which means that the world is and to make choices, which means that the world is now gray. The world is not black and white, but now not only do we have this ability, but we have this responsibility that goes with it. The onus. You think that it's so amazing that you now see things, but what that means is that you now have to engage all the time to be able to make choices among things, rather than not having to strain yourself to do so.
So in that sense, it's a little bit of a punishment too, is what you're saying, because
Yes.
it comes along with responsibility. Okay, that's an interesting way to look at it. There's a little bit of that in what the Rambam is going to answer. If anyone else wants to contribute, please do so. Otherwise, I'm going to read what Rambam has to say.
Yeah, my only thought, Shaul, is
Yes?
that maybe it's not a punishment.
Okay.
That
Okay.
that eating from the tree
Mhm.
Somehow had a transformational consequence to it, which
Mhm.
was this ability to discern. The punishment was being kicked out of the garden, toiling, giving birth in pain. But I don't. Again, I have to go back and look at the text.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the knowledge piece of it was punishment per se.
But it's more of a consequence. That's very good. That's also a little bit of that is going to be in Rambam's answer. So I think a little bit of what both of you said is going to be in Rambam's answer. But he's going to yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of I see. I have no idea how the response would be there
Yeah.
from the Rambam, but I would say that from a parent's point of view, as obviously a God, Father, it's the ultimate parent situation, right? To us, I mean, we were created by Him,
Mhm.
so I think of it like we tell a kid, hey, don't touch that, and then they touch it and they deal with the consequences of that, correct? And then so if we if we treat them in a way that it's not time for them to deal with certain responsibilities yet,
Mhm.
they're not ready for those responsibilities yet, so we're allowing them to deal with the lighter side of life, not dealing with it when they decide to pick up those responsibilities or take those responsibilities on or step over a boundary of understanding or knowledge or responsibility. Then we allow them to take on those responsibilities regardless of the age.
Right. When a child steps over the line, I thought of the child. I was going to use that child analogy later. Maybe I will anyway. But I like that too. So far, all three people had. We put it all together. We're getting closer and closer to what Rama was about to say. Someone else wants to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that,
Yeah.
that if you read it as punishment, which is what it seems to be, this is the original guilt. It's where the Christians take off in their whole theology. And for some reason, Jews don't read it that way. It's not original guilt. We're not being punished.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I'm not qualified to discuss original sin. I don't know enough about it to say anything about it. But we are about to learn at least Maimonides' understanding, and I'm going to show you where Maimonides gets it directly from the rabbis, from Chazal, from the Medrash, which I alluded to before we even started the recording. That this is really a lesson not of something that once happened in history a long time ago, and that changed the course of human history, but it's something that happens in all of our lives on a regular basis. But let's see what happens. Okay, so everybody, I think we put what everyone said, plus add what Rambam has to say. You're going to have a very new understanding of what really happened at the tree of knowledge. So here goes. So here now the intent of our reply. So Rambam is, as I mentioned, he's quick to he gets a little hot under the collar sometimes and is ready to criticize. You who engage in theoretical speculation, using the first notions that may occur to you. Notice you people that you just open this book, this Bible, and you just read it just like any other book, and you don't give 2 seconds of thought to think that maybe there's a lot more here than you think. And he's saying people for millennia, for thousands of years, have been looking at this and gaining inspiration, and you think you got it all just by reading it for a few seconds like you'd read a newspaper. And that was me paraphrasing what the Rambam was about to say. And if you don't like my paraphrasing, let's hear how he said it. Oh, you who engage in theoretical speculation, using the first notions that may occur to you and come to your mind, and who consider withal that you understand a book that is the guide of the first and last men, meaning people from all past in history to today, while glancing through it as you would glance through any Pines here translates historical, where Kapak translates the newspapers. In other words, the things what's happening today, just like you'd read the newspaper or a piece of poetry. When in some of your hours of leisure, you happen to have extra time, you leave off your drinking and partying and having sex. And then for a moment you think, you collect yourself and reflect, for things are not as you thought, following the first notion that occurred to you. I'm telling you now that whatever you thought during those few seconds you had to pick up the newspaper and, oh, there this Bible, I'll pick this up and read this thing about a snake and a woman. That's not the way it works. There's a lot more to it. Think a little more, Maimonides is saying. But rather, as it is made clear through reflection upon the following speech. Think about what I'm about to say and stop asking dumb questions. That's Maimonides. Now he stops criticizing others and he starts to tell us what he's having. For the intellect that God made overflow onto man, and that is the latter's ultimate perfection, that knowledge, that intellect that human beings have, makes human beings perfect in the sense as humans, right? That makes us special, was that which Adam had been provided with before he disobeyed. Adam had the intellect and the ability to discern and to know and to have knowledge when he was created. We said that last chapter. It has to be that way. God said we are going to nas adam b'tzalmeinu kidmusenu, right? We said in our form, in our image, and Maimonides explained to us that means that he has a special intellect. He has that discernment. It was because of this that it was said of him that it was created in the image of God in his likeness, which we just explained last week. It was likewise on account of this that he was dressed like a God and given commandments. How else could God have told him you're allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that? You can't command someone that doesn't have an intellect. You can't command an animal and say, eat this, don't eat that. The animal's going to eat what it wants to eat, right? And the Lord God commanded and so on. Commandments are not given to beasts and beings devoid of intellect. Through the intellect, one distinguishes between truth and falsehood. Now, here is where I want to give a little analogy from popular culture. For those that may have watched the comedy series, The Big Bang Theory, and on that series, there's a figure, Sheldon, right, who is the epitome of, he sees everything through the prism of science, right? Everything is or isn't, yes or no, black and white, right? There's no maybes, but I want, but I could, but I should. Everything is pure, true or false, right? Now, I'm not making, it's not 100% analogy, but I want you to think of that. And then I also want you to think of the other thing. Think about yourselves when you embarked upon anything in your life that of major importance, your career, your marriage, your anything that you embarked upon. When you said, I'm going to work an investment strategy, I'm going to, for how I'm going to save up money for my future. How am I going to build in my community? You sat down in the beginning with an ideal, with how things should be done, what was right and what is wrong, what I should do, what I shouldn't do, what I can partake of, what I cannot partake of. It was solid, it was clear, it was true and false. And that was found in Adam in its perfection and integrity. However, fine and bad, meaning tov and ra, good and bad, those, on the other hand, belong to things generally accepted as known. In other words, what the Rambam is saying, the translation is difficult from the original Arabic, but not to those cognized by the intellect. What Rambam means here is that if you look at a table, you don't say it's good or bad, right? It's a table. It is, or it's not a table, right? When you look at an action, then you can, or something that you know in your mind, you can then start to think, is this good or is this bad? And then you have to bring to bear all sorts of judgments, which is, in a moment, Rambam is going to explain, this is where the word Elohim comes from. I remember listening, it was recently, to a judge giving a talk, and she said the most difficult thing for her is sentencing. Because when you sentence someone, it's not a question of guilt, or in a sense, that was decided by the jury. But now I have to put into play, what were the motives? Does he really have regret? Do I really think he's going to do it again? Were there extenuating factors? That's really, really hard, because then you have to make judgment calls about good and bad. And it's nothing to do with true or false. It's a very, very different type of judgment. And when we go into, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we're going to read this in the words of Maimonides in a moment. When we go into our lives, we start off our career knowing whether if it's a career in medicine, say in my own personal example, I'm going to do everything right and by the book. You know, a simple example, if someone calls me and asks for an antibiotic and it's not indicated, I'm going to say no because it's the wrong thing, right? But then you get into practice and people start bugging you, and then you want your patients to be happy, and you have your time and you're rushed and you're this and you're that, and someone calls, what the difference? I'll give her the prescription. All right, little simple things all of a sudden. And at the beginning, everything is straight, right and wrong. That's what's right and wrong. False, not false. Correct, incorrect. And then all of a sudden, we step the boundary. Then comes one day, we step the boundary. We step over that boundary. And all of a sudden, that one day, everything changes. Everything. And he could never go back. And we know this is the theme of so many movies, so many novels, so much of our culture is based on this theme, that once a person steps over that line, you can never go back to the time of innocence when it's perfect. Everything from then on will always be what we often call a judgment call. And there's a reason why in English we choose judgment call. It goes back to this word Elohim, which means a judge. That step over the line. Adam and Eve could easily have done what the snake tried to convince them. What's wrong? It's a tree like every other tree. And who is that God anyway? He told you can eat all the other trees. Who does he think he is? You can go through a million justifications for it. But then once you take that step, you could never go back. And he says, for one does not say, and then Maimonides in a fascinating way, for those that wonder about when they found out the earth being round and flat, Maimonides says, true and false is not the same as good and bad. When you talk about true and false, you say things like this. Heaven is spherical, because Maimonides believed in the pre-Copernican ideas of astronomy, that the world was made, this universe is made of spheres, right? Heaven is spherical. That's true. That's a scientific fact, Maimonides says. It is bad. You don't say it is bad that Earth is flat, right? You say it's false that Earth is flat, right? Because everybody knows that the Earth is not flat. The Earth is round, right? So in case anyone still thinks of some notion that people thought the world was flat in 1,000 years ago, Maimonides uses that as the epitome of an example of something that's false, right? Is the Earth is flat. Like we know the Earth is clearly spherical. So but you don't describe it as bad, you describe it as false. That's what Maimonides is saying. Rather, one says it's true or false with regard to these assertions. You say it's true that the heaven is spherical, it's false that the earth is flat. Similarly, one expresses in our language the notions of truth and falsehood by means of the terms emet and sheker. If you want to talk about intellectual discernment, you talk about emet and sheker, meaning truth and falsehood. Those are fine and bad, but if you want to talk about something good and bad, then you talk about the terms tov and ra. Now, man, in virtue of his intellect, knows truth from falsehood. That intellect that we were given in the beginning, we know the difference between truth and falsehood. And this holds good for all intelligible things. Anything that you can tell, you can look at this and say, this is a plant, this is a flower, this is a tree, this is so on and so forth, right? Accordingly, when man was in his most perfect and excellent state in accordance with his inborn disposition and possessors of his intellectual cognitions, at that point, because it was said, as it says in Tehillim, you made him just a drop less than Elohim, than God. And that word Elohim is God referring to. He had no faculty that was engaged in any way in the consideration of generally accepted things. The person wasn't thinking, what's okay to do? When can we accept it? When's it okay to do a certain thing? When is it not okay to do a certain thing? Right? He did not apprehend them. He didn't even have an understanding of what does it mean to be okay or not okay. He just knew this is right, this is wrong, this is true, this is false. That's it. So among these generally accepted things, one of those things that he saw, or even that which is most manifestly bad, which we now look up as something bad, right? Or at least in Maimonides' time, times change and people have, which is part of the point here, namely uncovering the genitals, right? Walking around naked with genitals uncovered, that's bad. What does that mean it's bad, right? Nowadays, we could look at it and say that's bad. That's pornography. That's bad. That's lewd. That's wrong, right? But then it wasn't bad. He didn't apprehend it that it was bad. That's just genitals. That's it. It's not good or bad. It just is. That's what it is. And what do you do? And you can, it's not that he didn't have pleasure. Of course they did. They enjoyed the other trees. They enjoyed sexual intercourse. That was okay, right? It was okay, but it was not something that they thought of in terms of good versus bad. They thought of it in terms of is versus isn't. However, when he disobeyed and inclined towards his desires of the imagination and the pleasures of corporeal senses, when he stepped over that line and he did what he wasn't supposed to do, Inasmuch as it is said that the tree was good for food and it was a delight to the eyes, because it says the tree looked nice, it looked good. And he should have known that he wasn't supposed to. He stepped over that line. Then he was punished by being deprived of that intellectual apprehension. That intellectual apprehension at which he only knew between what's true and what's false, he now lost that whole ability. Now he's confused. Now he's lost, right? He therefore disobeyed the commandment that was imposed upon him on account of his intellect, and becoming endowed with the faculty of apprehending generally accepted things, he became absorbed in judging things to be bad or fine. Then the human being gets lost in this web, this confusing web of what's okay, what's not okay, which we still confused with every single day of our lives. The moment we step over that line, every single day of our lives, we live in this confusion. You know, how do I judge you? How do I judge you? And the circumstances that this person was raised in, and circumstances that this person was exposed to, is it understandable? Is it not understandable? And so on and so forth. We're totally lost in this mire of tov ra, of good and bad, which is very, very difficult to wade through. And I was thinking of Bobby mentioned the analogy to a child. You know, as when a child can be told, you're not allowed to lie. But then when the child gets exposed to his or her first lie, or he or she says their first lie, that's when they've stepped over that boundary. They're no longer an innocent child. Now it's confusing. And now they have to make judgment calls. And the word judgment is deliberate. It's a judgment. And that's why it says, you'll be like Elohim, you'll be like a judge that has to know between good and bad. So then he knew how great his loss was, what he had been deprived of, and upon what a state he had entered. Immediately, Adam and Eve looked at each other. They saw the genitals, which is an embodiment of something which, if one takes the judgment calls out of it and does what only they're supposed to, there would be no reason to cover them. The only reason why one has to cover them is because now one is lost in a world where one pursues his or her desires, regardless of whether or not it's emes or sheker, or whether it's true or false, but they do it because they think it's good, or they want it to be good, or they just like to, or it's not really so bad, etc., etc. Hence it is said, and you shall be like Elohim, knowing good and evil. It doesn't say you're going to be like God, knowing the false and the true, or apprehending the false and the true. With regard to what is of necessity, when we're talking about actual facts, there is no good and evil at all. There's only the false and the true. Reflect on what it says when it says, immediately their eyes were open, right? And they knew that they were naked. It doesn't say the eyes were both of them and they saw. It says their eyes were open because they were seeing the whole time. They saw each other naked the whole time. But for what they had seen previously was exactly the same thing as afterwards. Eve was standing naked, Adam was standing naked. They saw each other before eating the fruit, and they saw each other after eating the fruit. But what was different? There was no membrane, Maimonides says, over the eye, which is now removed. It wasn't like they were wearing sunglasses and all of a sudden God took their sunglasses off. But rather, he entered upon another state in which he considered as bad things which he had not seen in that light before. Now he looked at her and he says, oh, that's bad. And she looks at him and says, oh, that's bad. And immediately they covered themselves. Know, moreover, that this expression, I mean to open, again, Rambam flips back to his language though. When it says to open, vatipakachno refers only to uncovering mental vision. It doesn't mean that open their eyes literally. It means that they're in their mind. And he brings examples. Thus, and God opened their eyes, and the eyes of the blind shall be opened, opening it. But Rambam, like I told you, if ever he says something, he'll slam you with the evidence. So he brings verse after verse after verse, and so on. Now, and I'm at the bottom of page 25 in the Pines. Now, concerning its dictum with regarding to Adam. So now the Rambam then says something that's really fascinating, which clues us in into where the Rambam really draws his support. And when Rambam says anything that could be somewhat controversial, and I'm telling you the reason why would this idea be controversial, because you will find in many places in the Talmud, all places which seem to be stating that this is not exactly what happened when the Eitz HaDat was eaten, that some kind of dot, some kind of new knowledge was all of a sudden acquired by humanity. So the Rambam has to always convince you and bring support for his ideas so that you don't think that he just made this up. So he goes to a verse in Job, in Job. Job is chapter 14, where Job is the chapter 14 there starts off discussing humanity in general, where Job is talking about humanity, he talks about people. It starts off, the first verse of chapter 14 is Adam Yulud Isha, man born of woman, Kitzar Yamim, he's short of days, Usva Roges, and his life is full of troubles. And then it goes on and on and on. But then in verse 14 of that, what is it, 14? Hold on. I'm sorry, verse 20 of that chapter, that's Job 14, it says, Titkefeu lo netzach vayahaloch. God, you overpower him forever. And he goes. And then the end of that verse is Mishaneh panav, human beings, humanity turns his face, and you send him out. Now, this verse seems to be hinting towards the humanity. When he turned his face in the Garden of Eden, God sent him out. That Vital Shalachei. Where else in history did God send humanity, all of humanity, out of somewhere? That would be in the Garden of Eden. So Rambam says, now, so since that is referring to that, what does it mean? Mishaneh panav, he turns his face. The interpretation and explanation of the verse are as follows. When the direction towards which man tended changed, when he turned his face to a different direction, when he looked and started going another way on his own, he decided to go another way. For panim, when it says the word panim, it comes from the word pano, which means to turn. Since man turns his face, what does it mean he turns his face? When you turn your face towards something, it's referencing, I want to go that way. I want to go that way. I'm supposed to be going this way, but I'm turning down the other way because it looks good, because I like it, because I want to go there, right? He wishes to take that as his objective. God told me to go this way. I'm turning that way because that looks better. That looks good. So then the verse states accordingly that when you changed your direction towards which he tended and took as his objective the very thing, a previous commandment that had been not to aim at, God told him, don't aim this way, aim that way. And the person was going that way. He says, no, I'm going this way. Well, as soon as he turned his face and decided to go this way, God said, I'm sending you on that way. That's the way you want to go, then that's the way you'll go. And it's going to lead straight out of the Garden of Eden. Because the Garden of Eden is the place for someone who chooses emes and sheker, truth and falseness, not the place for a person who chooses to go after what he or she wants. If you're going to choose to go after what he or she wants, then you belong somewhere else, and you belong in a different type of world, a type of world that's full of judgment calls, a type of world that's full of pitfalls. And that's where we all are. We all make these mistakes in our lives. We all do this, and if we all look back at the steps that we've made in our lives, we can see that. We all start off with an ideal. We all start off with knowing how perfect we're going to be, and then we all decide, for various reasons, at some point to step over those boundaries, and then we get ourselves mired in a big mess. This is why this entire story, and the Rambam is going to be true with this, and every single time we study, we're going to realize that all of these ideas that seem like faraway myths from some long lost time are actually things that are so relevant to us in our everyday lives. This was the punishment corresponding to his disobedience. Now let's go back and answer what that man's question was. What was the punishment? This is exactly the punishment, right? Because you chose. He had been given license to eat good things and enjoy ease and tranquility. He had permission to sit here. He could have had everything he wanted, anything she wanted. It was all there, and they could have eaten it and everything. But when, however, as we said, he became greedy, he decided, no, I want more. I want something else. Followed his pleasures and his imaginings. And he says, I want to go because I decided that this is better. And he ate what he had been forbidden to eat. And the one thing he told not to eat, he decided to go and eat it. He was deprived of everything. Then the just punishment for that was to have everything taken away, and said, you know what? If that's the way you're going to go, then go ahead, go after what you want, and let's see where it takes you. You're going to have to work hard for it. You're going to have to immediately, and only this, he had to eat the meanest kinds of food, which he had not used as element before, and this only after toil and labor. If you want to go after what you want, then fine, go after what you want, and you're going to have to work for it. You're going to have to break your back. You're going to have to toil. You're going to have to plow. You're going to have to plant. You're going to have to weed. You're going to have so on and so forth. As it says, thorns and thistles shall bring forth, and so on. I'm going to skip some of those verses. And God reduced him with respect to his food and most of his circumstances to the level of the beast. And with respect to many parts of our lives, because we chose the path of the animals, that's why we have to live on a certain level, just like them. It says accordingly, and thou shalt eat the grass of the field. And it says also an explanation of the story, Adam, unable to dwell in dignity, is like the beasts that speak not. And then the Rambam ends, as he usually does, with looking to God again, And I'm careful when he gives a little intro and now again, when he gives a little ending to point this out, because it's important. Rambam immediately looks to God and says, praised be the master of the will, whose aims and wisdom cannot be apprehended, whose God's wisdom is so high that we can't even get there. Praise be God for the incredible wisdom that we can't even achieve and get to. So we went from someone who so foolishly and stupidly read this book as if it's nonsense, as if it's the newspaper, as if it's some random poem, right, after he has a full belly from a good meal, after he sleeps with his wife, hopefully, and then he goes and he sits on the couch and he pulls out the newspaper, and then he pulls out a Genesis and reads it for 5 minutes and thinks he knows everything, to a wisdom of God that is so high, so lofty, and so holy that we can't even achieve it, and we can't even come to understanding that. This is how Rambam understands the story. I had more to say, but I think this is a good stop to end. I would like to open the floor to comments, thoughts, especially if this changed the way you think of this story for life. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that. Floor is open. Yes.
I'll start.
Yes.
So, yeah, it does. I feel like this is very illuminating in understanding better, how to better understand the story. But what made me think of was what we've been discussing, learning in the Daf, right?
Mm-hmm.
In Chagiga, about those areas of knowledge which should be or are beyond our right to inquire, right? Which
Yes.
is a hard concept, I think, for 21st century intellectuals and professionals and people like us who are trained to ask questions and search, and the Talmud is telling us that there's a boundary beyond which searching becomes counterproductive. It messes up your mind, right? And it just made me think of this story here where it's as if God said to Adam at the beginning, like, you can have everything, but there's just certain things that aren't good for you to even inquire about. And if you go eat of that tree, you'll put yourself into that realm, and there's lots of bad consequences to it.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, and for those that aren't familiar, Chagiga is the tractate of the Talmud that a lot of people in this group are studying together now in the Daf Yomi program. So some people that aren't following, I just want to make sure they know what you're referring to. And it does mention there, like the Rambam mentioned, and he quoted the Talmud and Chagiga that there are certain areas of knowledge that you shouldn't inquire of. I think we're going to find as we go through Rambam that his understanding, and we touched on it already, and someone mentioned it earlier, that his understanding of that is not inquiring into things that are likely to lead you into misunderstanding very important truths. And that the smarter and more intellectual you are, the less likely you are to be misled into those kinds of dangerous misunderstandings. Which is why the Talmud Chagiga says these kinds of things should only be taught with two people, or at least only with one, and only the kind of person who's capable of understanding it. And Maimonides in this book is trying to tread that very thin line between because there are facts that he wants everyone to know. There are facts that, like I started with the exoteric, there's a lot of things in here that he wants everyone to know, like what we studied today, But then there's other things he realizes that if people don't know it, if people try to study it, they're going to get the wrong idea and it'll cause problems.
I guess I'm having a little bit of a problem because Rambam puts on the highest level intellect and reflection. And intellect and reflection involves the ability to make judgments and to evaluate good and evil, to make a whole range of judgments about things. And before man ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, man was on a lower level of intellect. He could observe, he could categorize, but he didn't have the ability to make the reflections and the judgment. which Rambam says is the highest purpose and goal of man, to be able to exercise your intellect in this way. So there's a little bit of a conflict there, a little bit of tension with this concept that this is a punishment.
I wonder, think about this for me. I'm going to expand a little on what you just said, and that think about it like this. I think about a lot of times you watch a movie which is based on this kind of idea, right? I can't think of one offhand, but this idea where a person starts off as innocent, and then they make a mistake, and they go through a whole, thing, and then they come out at the end, somehow wiser, because they went through the experience. So ask yourself the question, would it have been better had I not made the mistake in the first place? Or would it have been better where I am now? Or we can think in our own lives, if we look back at mistakes that we've made, right? We look back and we say, I know that was a mistake, right? Okay, thanks. I know that was a mistake, right? But now I made it. I suffered consequences. I learned lessons. And now, arguably at least, I'm a better person for it. So am I better off? Is it a reward, right? Or would I have been better off if I never made the mistake again? And I'm not ready to answer that question, because it's I don't know if there is an answer to that question, but I think that's what we're seeing here.
I love this question.
Yeah. What do you
I
think?
love this question.
Yes.
If I could just add, just quoting what you just read,
Yeah.
it doesn't go according to the text. He says, we're driven out. This was the punishment corresponding to his disobedience. It was measure for measure. And here it is. He had been given license to eat good things and to enjoy ease and tranquility. So it sounds like that was great, eat good things. And he says, when he became greedy, which is a derogatory term, following his pleasures and his imaginings, again, so there's something wrong with that, he's suggesting, and ate what he had been forbidden, he was deprived of everything and had to eat the meanest, blah, 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 blah. So it just doesn't seem consistent with any sense of justice here.
Can we,
What happened? Go ahead. Yeah.
can we kind of like think of it again as parents or children of parents, if we don't have children ourselves? For example, I have a 18-year-old, soon to be 19-year-old son. I love my son. I would die for my son. Most fathers would, right? So with that being said, if I tell him to not do something, such as don't take cash that I've put up for a rainy day or for a bill, and he was to go and take that cash from me, and it caused really serious troubles in my home, being an adult man that he is, honestly twice the man that I am physically, and having a great job and stuff, that may not cause me to kick him out, and have the hard times and to toil and the thistles and thorns, right? But there could be a line that he could cross where I would still love him, and I would still know that he would be okay, but he would just have a little bit harder life than being here at home. And you could take it another way also. I could say, son, don't move out yet. You're 18, you need to be smart, stay at home, save your money, keep working, and build a good life, build your credit, these type of things. But don't go getting rent. And he could say, to hell with that. I want the knowledge of life. I'm going to go move out. And I could say, okay, well, you want that path? Take it, son. Go move out. And then he could suffer having to pay rent and eating ramen noodles or what have you. So I kind of think that, we don't necessarily understand the way that God thinks necessarily, the eternity and the lifespan of a man, that whole thing. But as a whole, I believe if we can comprehend God as a father and the mercy involved with being a parent and the love and the forgiveness, and then also sometimes the whether it be punishment or just allowing a child to figure it out the hard way because they're being hard-headed. We are children to God, and we are hard-headed ourselves. We all grow from childhood to adulthood, and so we can understand the human species growing from childhood to adulthood, with intellect and understanding and those types of things.
Going back to the question about whether or not Rambam believed that people change their capacity afterwards. I think what I read out of this was that Rambam believed that the innate capacity of the human was there from the time that they were created. And what changed was that, without his using these words, basically the perspective changed, so that the context in which the capacity was utilized differed. Is that a fair? You're muted, Shaul.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so then the punishment would have been like, I think it was Jeff said in the beginning, that the punishment is kicking him out and making him on his own, which also dovetails with what Bobby was saying, that you know, the punishment is that he has to go live on his own. But the change in the context, the change in the type of decisions that he needed to make and judgments that he needed to make, that wasn't necessarily a punishment, that was a consequence. You know, and I think that would be a reasonable way to understand what Rambam just said.
You mind if I ask a question?
Please.
Okay.
Yes.
It seems to me that Adam was in a primitive state. He could not distinguish things morally, what was good and bad. Is that correct so far?
Well, I don't know if he could not, but he didn't have to, because if you don't step over that boundary, then the good and bad doesn't matter until someone breaks down the wall between the two.
Okay. But it seems to me that they're gaining a sense of morality, of being able to distinguish between good and evil would be an enhancement to man, not something that would be a punishment. Or, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm just, yeah. Can you help me with that? Maimonides seems to be saying that that it's bad, that we should have remained in the primitive state.
It would have been better had we never made the mistake in the first place, but we did.
Okay.
You know? But go ahead. I'm going to see if someone else wants to answer that. I can take a shot. Well, you know what? I'll tell you what I think the answer is that Maimonides is saying, like one of our. I'm sorry if I don't remember who it was, but someone had said in the beginning that this was actually just a consequence. The change in the nature of our intellect was a consequence of following our desires as opposed to doing what we should have done, right? And living within the parameters that we were given. The punishment was that God said, okay, if that's your choice, if that's the kind of life you want to lead, a life in which you go after what you want, not go after what is right, then I'm going to kick you out of here, and you're not going to enjoy the ability of living in this world, the privilege of living in this world where everything is all set for you. You're going to have to go out, you're going to have to work hard, and that's the punishment part, right? And then you'll have to prove yourself in a different way completely. And so it's in a way that we all live our own lives, you know, we live a life of innocence until we make that mistake, and all of a sudden the work of our life becomes very different. It becomes a judgment call at every single step of the way.
So everything was idyllic before.
Yeah, and some David just pointed out that in the chat that they had the ability to choose even before they chose the bad choice, right? And Rama made it very clear. They were given a choice. There was such a thing as desire, right? But as long as you stay within the right parameters, you're okay. It's when you make the choice to go into the wrong direction. I just had a conversation with a patient today about smoking cessation, a woman who was a smoker. And I said, you know, I'm very happy that I never undertook that habit, you know, because if I did, then I don't know if I would have the personal strength to stop smoking. I don't know, right? Maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'd be in the same position that she was and having difficulty stopping smoking, right? But as long as I live in this world now, smoking is bad. I know that, it's bad for a whole lot of reasons. So I don't smoke. So it's easy. But once you step over the line, then it doesn't become easy anymore.
And even at that point, you're now talking about something that is in some measure beyond free will, when you're talking about smoking and addiction.
Yeah,
Right, which is different than, say, having an afternoon donut.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like temptation, right? In general, I mean, from a young age, you're told to not do a certain thing, and then you're tempted. And from the time that you're tempted, some people choose to do the thing they're tempted to do, and some people don't. And then you get the addiction afterward.
Right.
So.
Right. So we can go on for a while, but we will next week. And we're going to continue. And if anyone, the article that I referenced before, if anyone wants it, just text me or email me or whatever offline, and I'll send it to you. And I'm going to try, as I come across other articles, because I come across them all the time, that might be relevant to what we're studying together in Rambam. I'll let you know during the class. So I'll bring them to everyone's attention, because there's a lot of scholarly work on Maimonides' guide that's relevant to all of our discussions here. And I'll try to give you guys a taste and a flavor of that if you're interested.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
All right. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's well.